Welcome everyone to my studio. Today I will be demonstrating how to paint wildlife in pastel. I will be using Pastelmat for this demonstration, and my reference photo is from a photographer named Daiken from Canada. This demonstration is about 20 minutes long, so look over my shoulder and join me with the development of this little weasel. Thank you. This will be my second time using Pastelmat, so I still have a bit of a learning curve with this product also. I've decided to use the gray Pastelmat because I think it will help in the shadowed areas of the white weasel. I've already drawn the outlines of my weasel, and as I begin, I usually like to start with their eyes. Their eyes are the most important focal point of the painting, so I want to get this right. I've popped up a picture of the weasel's head so that you can follow along as I develop the areas in his eyes and nose. I outlined his eyes with some light purple, and then I'm switching to my black pastel pencil to draw the pupil in each eye. He has very dark eyes, and they seem to be reflecting some of the colors from his surrounding. I'm using a dark brown and a maroon color to give his pupil some color. I will continue to shape the color of his eyes and use some navy blue to give some more depth to the shadowed areas in his eyes. I only use the black for the darkest areas within his eyes and for the iris. I will come back in with the black pencil to define the outline of his eye a little more clearly. It's good to have good color saturation in his eyes before beginning to add some of the highlights that reflect off the surface of his eyes. I'm going to use some light blue to add some of the reflections to the surface of his eyes. Then I will come back with a blending stick to blend it very smoothly to give it a natural appearance. I will continue to add some more color to shade his eyes, and I especially like to use a little bit of purple in the lighter areas that are reflecting in his eyes. Once blended, I'll come back with the black pastel pencil to define his iris a little more clearly. Once I have done this, I can begin working on the skin that surrounds his pupil. I am outlining these areas with some black first, and then I'll come back with some dark gray to fill in the lighter areas of the skin. This will help give this area some shape and a little bit of highlights to give it a round fullness. So I'm really happy how his eyes have turned out. They seem to have a lot of expression. So now I can move on to shaping his little nose. So first I will outline the shape of his nose and define where his little nostrils are and add a little bit of shading to the darkest areas of his nose. I'm using a shade of burnt umber, kind of a reddish brown, to create the color in his nose. I will use my paper stump to blend the color in his nose. So this is a very small area and I really can't use my finger for the blending. So now his nose is blocked in, but I will wait until I've added some fur to the weasel's face before I finish the shading and final details to his nose. I'm going to begin developing the weasel's ears before I add any of the fur details to his face. I'm using a shade of burnt umber and a peach color soft pastel stick to create the color within his ears. I will use a sponge applicator to blend this color very smoothly. I'm going to define the shape of his mouth and then add a little bit of the pink shading to give some shape to his jawline. Now I can add some color to the paper to create a base foundation for applying more pastels. I'm beginning with a shade of gray, and then I will also add some darker gray to define the darkest shadowed areas of the weasel's face. I will use light shades of gray on the surface of the fur, and then I will switch to the white pastel for the final details in the fur of his body. Once I have blended this layer of color with my sponge applicator, then I'll be able to move on and start creating some real fur texture. I will be using a light shade of gray to begin creating fur texture in the weasel's face. I will follow the contour of his face and the direction of the fur laying on his face. As I apply this application of fur details, you will see that the gray base that we first created is beginning to show through and define the shadowed areas beneath these fine hairs. I will continue to shape his fur using this light gray pastel stick before I move on to lighter shades of gray and white. I've established some fullness to his fur, and I want to add a little more shading and color to his neckline. And I'm using a light pink to add and blend with some light gray to create some color in his fur. I'm going to define some of the darker shadowed areas in his fur with my darker pastels. As I begin to add some of these darker areas to his fur, you will see the texture begin to build and create lots of depth to the fur. I'm continuing to use my dark gray to help define the neckline and muzzle area of his face. It's very important to follow the contour of his face and the direction of his fur to really render his muzzle area accurately. So here I want to start defining the placement of where his whiskers will be. However, I won't place his whiskers until the last step after his entire fur has been completed. I will add a little bit more fur details, and then I will use my blending stump to smooth and blend his fur and his muzzle area. I continually add and blend my strokes for a natural appearance. His muzzle area has come together very nicely, so I want to go in and begin adding some of those final details to his mouth and nose. I haven't defined his nostrils yet, so I want to go back in and add a little more shading and detail to his nose. It's much easier to shape and shadow his nose once the white fur has been placed around it. I don't want his nose to appear flat, so I'll add some richer colors to shape and define it. I will try to deepen the color a little bit more and add a little more highlight to the top surface of his nose. I am now ready to start using my white pastel to create the top layer of white fur. This will bring out the highlights and luster in his white fur. I'm adding some short white hair to his muzzle area. They will highlight the fur around his whiskers. Before I can finish the fur around his face, I will need to work on the background of this painting. The weasel has a den within an old dead tree. I will gradually block in the background and work my way down the painting. I think his fur is shaping up very nicely, so I am ready to move on to the next stage of this painting by working on the background and then continuing with his fur. I have already blocked in some of the background to this painting. However, there's much work still to be done on the background. What I wanted to do is place some of the background so that I could add some of the fur details that extend into the background. I will continue to refine the fur of the weasel and gradually build the background as I go. I'm going to zoom up here a little bit so I can finish the details in his feet. I'm going to use some pink between his toes and a shade of very light gray to create the fur extending on his feet. I will also shape and highlight his toenails with a shade of very light pink. And then I'll switch to my white pastel to finish the fur around his feet. I'm now ready to begin drawing in the weasel's whiskers. Be sure to have a very sharp point before beginning the strokes of creating the whisker. My whiskers are turning out very nicely on this pastel matte surface. Typically, I use a UArt sanded paper for most of my drawings and paintings, and I've never been able to achieve a very sharp line on my UArt paper. So I'm very pleased with the results with my pastel paper. I hope you have enjoyed this episode on how to paint wildlife in pastel. I have really enjoyed painting this winter white weasel, and if you have liked this video, please press like, and if you haven't subscribed already, please do. And I look forward to seeing you with future lessons and videos in pastel. Thank you.